Hi, welcome to my channel. I have a new story for you today.
My name is Vivian Hughes. I am 26 years old. Just a few days ago, I sat at a shadowed table near the kitchen doors of a Bellevue estate while my father handed my brother the keys to a corporate empire in a $15 million waterfront mansion. My father told 200 of Seattle's wealthiest investors that my brother Julian was a Stanford genius, born to lead. Then he pointed at me and told the crowd I would always have a metal desk in the basement because I was the sweet, slow girl who couldn't handle real business. The audience laughed. My father smiled. My brother smirked. None of them knew I was sitting there with a cashier's check for $55 million in my purse. And they certainly did not know. The software I built in secret was about to put our family's logistics company out of business. Before I explain how a basement admin dismantled a Seattle dynasty, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell me if you have ever been the scapegoat in your family. Now, let me take you back to that June afternoon. The air off Lake Washington carried the scent of catered salmon and expensive cologne. Julian had just returned from California with his MBA. My parents threw a graduation party that looked more like a corporate summit. I wore a plain dress. I bought off the rack. I was assigned to table 42. It sat right next to the service entrance where the catering staff rushed in and out. It was exactly where my family wanted me. Out of sight, at 30. My father, Richard Hughes, tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The chatter across the manicured lawn faded. Richard stood under a white canopy with Julian right beside him. My father ran Hughes Global Logistics. It was a regional shipping powerhouse that had operated in the Pacific Northwest for 3 decades. He ran the company like a dictator, and he ran our family the same way. Thank you all for being here. My father began. His voice boomed through the sound system. Today we celebrate the future. Julian has returned to us as a Stanford graduate. He has the mind and the drive to take Hughes Global into the next century. Therefore, effective Monday morning, I am stepping down as CEO and handing the reins to my son. The crowd erupted into applause. Julian offered a practiced, humble nod. He raised his glass to the investors. My father held up a hand to quiet the crowd again. And because a new CEO needs a proper headquarters, I am officially transferring the deed to this Bellevue estate into Julian's name. A murmur of approval rippled through the guests. My mother, Beatrice, stood near the front row, wiping a proud tear from her cheek. Then my father scanned the crowd. His eyes drifted past the executives and the politicians. He found me hiding in the back. Of course. We cannot forget my daughter. Vivian, he said. His tone shifted, taking on that familiar condescending pity. Vivian will be staying on at the company as well. We are keeping her desk right down in the basement where it is quiet. She struggles with the fast pace upstairs. But she is a sweet girl. We take care of our own. Even the slow ones. 200 people turned in their seats to look at me. A low murmur of laughter rippled through the lawn. The heat rushed to my cheeks. Julian caught my eye from the stage and gave me a mocking little salute. I looked down at my hands. I dug my fingernails into my palms until they bled. That was when the stranger appeared. He did not come from the main house. He seemed to materialize from the edge of the garden. He was a tall man, with silver hair, wearing a bespoke gray suit that cost more than my yearly salary. He bypassed the VIP section. He ignored the stage. He walked straight to table 42 and stood beside my chair. I looked up at him. He did not introduce himself. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with red wax. He slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it touched my water glass. He leaned down. The applause from my brother was still echoing across the lawn. The stranger looked me dead in the eyes and lowered his voice so only I could hear. Now is the time to show them who you really are. He stood back up, turned around, and disappeared into the crowd before I could even ask his name. I sat frozen. The heavy envelope rested on the table. Up on the stage, my brother was laughing, posing for photos with his new empire. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The applause from the lawn was still ringing in my ears as I pushed my chair back from table 42. I grabbed the heavy cream envelope and walked away from the white canopy. No one turned to watch me leave. The guests were too busy raising their crystal flutes to the new CEO of Hughes Global Logistics. I slipped through the glass doors of the main house. Seeking refuge, the Bellevue estate was a sprawling monument to my father's success. Vaulted ceilings and imported hardwood floors stretched out before me. This was the house my brother Julian had just inherited for simply existing. I found the guest bathroom down the hall and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. The bathroom alone was larger than my entire apartment in the city. It featured floor-to-ceiling marble and brushed gold fixtures. A vanity mirror spanned the entire length of the wall, reflecting my cheap off-the-rack dress. I leaned against the cold stone counter and dropped my purse. My hands were shaking so severely I could barely grip the envelope. The red wax seal felt warm against my thumb. I stared at my reflection under the harsh vanity lights. I did not look like a corporate mastermind. I looked exactly like the person my father had just described to 200 wealthy investors. The slow girl, the basement admin, the family disappointment. That label was not a recent invention. It had been stitched into my identity since childhood. Growing up in the Hughes household meant you were measured by one single metric: academic perfection. Julian thrived under that pressure. He possessed the kind of mind that could scan a textbook once and recite every paragraph flawlessly. When he was 12 years old, my parents began hiring Ivy League tutors. Princeton graduates and standardized test coaches practically lived in our dining room, charging hundreds of dollars an hour to guarantee his future. They groomed him for the boardroom from the moment he could hold a pen. I was wired differently. Words printed on a page refused to stick in my memory. Whenever a teacher delivered a lecture, the sentences would blur together in my mind, turning into a wall of white noise. Undiagnosed ADHD and severe auditory processing issues made traditional classrooms a daily nightmare for me. Instead of seeking specialists or finding ways to help me learn, my mother and father simply gave up. They sighed. They lowered their expectations to the floor. By the time I reached high school, they stopped asking to see my report cards altogether. They started calling me the dumb one. They did not say it to my face at first, but I heard them whispering in the kitchen late at night. They decided early on that I lacked the basic intellect required to contribute to the family legacy. But my parents were fundamentally wrong about how my brain functioned. I could not memorize historical dates or recite classic literature, but I possessed a photographic memory for complex systems. I could look at a tangled visual puzzle, a sprawling city grid, a complicated subway map, or a chaotic web of commercial supply routes, and instantly identify the inefficiencies. I saw the entire world in interlocking patterns. The very traits my parents dismissed as a mental defect were actually the foundation of a rare gift. I just needed the right raw data to unlock it. I looked down at the envelope resting on the marble counter. The silver-haired stranger had told me it was time to show them who I really was. I dug my fingernail under the red wax and broke the seal. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled the thick documents out. The first page was a finalized acquisition term sheet printed on heavy, watermarked paper. At the top center, stamped in bold black ink, was the corporate crest for Apex Tech. Apex was not just a software company. They were the reigning engineering juggernaut in Seattle. They were famous for devouring regional logistics businesses and replacing human error with automated digital empires. I flipped to the second page. Pinned to the top left corner was a certified cashier check. My eyes traced the printed numbers scanning across the paper. A 5. Another 5. 6 zeros. $55 million, payable directly to Vivian Hughes. It was the official buyout payment for an advanced analytics algorithm I had coded entirely alone in my cramped studio apartment over the past 3 years. I had created a predictive routing software capable of cutting commercial shipping delays by an unprecedented 40%. I built the architecture using the spatial logic and visual processing my parents thought made me stupid. I traced the raised lettering on the check with my index finger. The crisp paper felt unreal against my skin. It represented more liquid capital than my father had, generated in his last decade as the head of Hughes Global. I was standing in the guest bathroom of a $15 million estate, holding a single piece of paper that made me vastly wealthier than the arrogant brother who had just inherited the property. Before the gravity of that number could fully settle into my bones, a loud pounding rattled the bathroom door. The brass handle twisted sharply from the outside. I jumped back from the counter, clutching the papers to my chest. Vivian opened the door right now. It was Julian. His voice carried that familiar, impatient bite. It was the exact tone he reserved for valet's waitstaff and me. I know you are hiding in there. Vivian, stop pouting. I quickly folded the term sheet and shoved the documents back into the heavy envelope. I did not answer him right away. I needed to steady my breathing. Listen to me. He barked through the solid wood door. A caterer just dropped a heavy silver tray of champagne glasses near the front foyer. The staff is too busy plating the salmon for the VIP tables to deal with it. Dad wants the lobby spotless before the investors walk through for the private house tour. Go find a mop in the utility closet and clean up the mess right now. Do not embarrass us today. Do something useful for once. He pounded his fist against the door one final time before his heavy footsteps faded down the hardwood hallway. 10 minutes earlier, that interaction would have shattered me. I would have quietly unlocked the door, kept my head down, fetched the mop, and cleaned up the broken glass while my brother's fraternity friends watched. I would have swallowed the burning humiliation because it was the only role my family ever allowed me to play. I was conditioned to serve them. But standing under the bright, recessed lighting of that marble bathroom, something fundamental broke inside me. The lifelong fear evaporated. The desperate, aching need for their approval vanished entirely. I picked up the cream envelope from the counter. I slipped the $55 million check into my cheap faux leather purse and zipped it securely shut. I looked at my reflection in the mirror one last time. My posture had shifted. My shoulders were pulled back. My jaw was set tight. Julian wanted me to mop his floor. He wanted to parade his Stanford degree around the lawn and treat his own sister like the hired help. He had no idea the woman he was barking orders at had just sold the exact technology that was going to render his inherited shipping empire obsolete. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped out into the hallway. I was going to fetch the mop. I was going to clean up his spilled champagne with a smile on my face because by Monday morning, my brother was going to need a lot more than a mop to clean up the wreckage of his company. I walked out of the guest bathroom and kept my head lowered. I bypassed the catered buffet and found the utility closet tucked behind the main staircase. The small room smelled of industrial bleach and wet cotton. I grabbed a plastic yellow bucket, a sponge, and a heavy mop. I carried the cleaning supplies down the hallway toward the grand foyer. The spill was exactly where Julian said it was. A silver catering tray lay upside down on the imported Persian rug. Shattered crystal glass and expensive vintage champagne soaked into the intricate woven fabric. Julian was standing a few feet away, leaning against a marble pillar. Two of his former fraternity brothers stood beside him, wearing tailored linen suits and imported Italian loafers. They were laughing, holding fresh drinks they had procured from the outdoor bar. Julian stopped mid-sentence when he saw me approach with the mop. A cruel smirk spread across his face. He gestured toward me with his drink. "Look who finally decided to join the workforce," he said loud enough for his friends to hear. "Try not to miss the corners." "Vivian, we have venture capitalists walking through this lobby in 10 minutes. I cannot have them stepping in broken glass because my sister does not know how to handle a sponge." His friends chuckled. One of them took a sip of his drink and looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. I did not look at their faces. I knelt on the damp rug and began picking up the jagged shards of crystal. I placed the broken pieces into the plastic bucket one by one. I wrung out the sponge and started scrubbing the champagne out of the expensive wool fibers. My brother stood there, watching me perform manual labor on the day he inherited a fortune. He felt powerful. He felt superior. He thought he was putting me in my designated place. He had no clue that the heavy faux leather purse resting against my hip contained a check that could buy his entire estate 3 times over. I stayed quiet. I let him enjoy his illusion of dominance. I knew better than anyone else in that house how fragile his new empire truly was. As I dragged the wet mop across the hardwood border, my mind drifted away from the Bellevue mansion. I thought about the place where I had spent the last 4 years. The basement headquarters of Hughes Global Logistics. My father kept the corporate offices in a high-rise building in downtown Seattle. The executive suite occupied the top floor, featuring panoramic views of the Puget Sound mahogany desks and catered lunches. My desk was located on the lowest subterranean level. I worked in a windowless room constructed of painted cinder block. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed with a constant headache-inducing hum. My official title was administrative filing clerk. My salary was $35,000 a year before taxes. It was barely enough to cover the rent for my cramped studio apartment near the train tracks. My daily routine was meant to be mindless. Hughes Global still operated on an archaic analog system. The truck drivers filled out triplicate carbon copy shipping manifests by hand. At the end of every week, boxes of these paper records were dumped on my metal desk. My job was to manually type the freight weights, the departure times, the route numbers, and the fuel logs into a database built in the late 1990s. I was supposed to be a human typewriter. My father assigned me this role because he believed it required zero analytical thought. But down in that silent basement, my brain began to do what it always did. It categorized data. It built visual structures out of chaos. After typing thousands of shipping logs, I stopped seeing isolated numbers. I started seeing a giant illuminated map of the Pacific Northwest. I memorized every highway, every mountain pass, and every commercial loading dock from Spokane to Portland. I could see the trucks moving in my mind because I could see the entire system. I immediately saw the fatal flaws. Hughes Global was bleeding capital. The company dispatched heavy freight trucks on terrible circular routes. Drivers were burning thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, sitting in predictable traffic bottlenecks that could easily be bypassed. Even worse were the return trips. I noticed a staggering pattern of deadheading. Our drivers would drop off a lucrative payload in Idaho and drive the 1-8-wheeler all the way back to Seattle, entirely empty. They burned fuel and paid driver hours while generating zero revenue on the return journey. I spent long nights in the basement crunching the numbers. The inefficiency was not just a minor operational leak. The company was hemorrhaging millions of dollars every single fiscal quarter due to outdated logistical planning. I decided to fix it. I spent a month building a comprehensive visual model. I bought a cheap binder and filled it with color-coded charts, graphs, and modified route maps. I proved mathematically that a simple algorithmic shift could save the company $8 million in fuel and labor within 6 months. It was brilliant. It was undeniable. I took the binder upstairs. I stood outside my father's corner office until his secretary allowed me inside. Richard Hughes sat behind his sprawling desk, reviewing a golf magazine. I placed the binder in front of him. I tried to explain the deadhead miles in the fuel burn. I pointed to the charts, showing the massive profit loss. My father did not even open the cover. He stared at me with profound exhaustion. He pushed the Ronnet binder back across the polished wood. "Vivian," he said, sighing heavily. "You type invoices. You do not design corporate strategy. Logistics requires a level of complex critical thinking that you simply do not possess. Stop playing with markers and leave the thinking to the Stanford men. Go back downstairs and finish filing the July receipts." He dismissed me with a wave of his hand. He chose to lose millions of dollars rather than admit his defective daughter had a functioning brain. That rejection was the catalyst. When I walked back down to the basement, I threw the binder in the trash. I realized that if my father refused to implement my routing solution, I would just build the software myself. I would code an automated artificial intelligence platform. I would register it under a blind, limited liability company. And I would sell it to the highest bidder in the technology sector. I squeezed the dirty mop water into the yellow bucket. The foyer floor was spotless. Julian and his friends had already walked away, bored with my silence. I carried the cleaning supplies back to the utility closet. I washed my hands in the sink and dried them on a paper towel. I stepped back out into the fading afternoon sunlight of the garden. The party was reaching its peak. A jazz band played softly near the pool. I watched my father standing near the outdoor bar. He was shaking hands with a prominent commercial bank executive, bragging about the legacy he was passing down to his Stanford-educated son. He looked so proud. He looked invincible. I retreated to the shadow of a tall, manicured hedge. I unzipped my cheap purse. I bypassed the cashier's check for $55 million. I reached deeper into the envelope and pulled out the secondary document the silver-haired lawyer had delivered. It was a strategic acquisition memo printed on Apex Tech letterhead. It was stamped strictly confidential in red ink. I unfolded the thick paper and read the executive summary. The shock hit me in waves. Apex Tech had not just purchased my software to improve their internal operations. They bought my algorithm for a specific predatory initiative. Apex was launching a hostile expansion into the regional commercial freight sector. The tech giant planned to deploy my routing software to drastically undercut the shipping rates of all legacy competitors. They were going to offer retail clients faster shipping at a fraction of the cost. The memo detailed a brutal corporate strategy designed to starve outdated logistics companies of their retail contracts and force them into rapid bankruptcy. I flipped to the second page of the document. There was a short bulleted list of the primary regional targets slated for hostile disruption. These were the companies Apex Tech intended to crush within the next 12 months. At the very top of the Apex kill list, printed in bold black ink, was Hughes Global Logistics. I looked up from the paper and stared across the lawn at my brother. Julian was clinking his glass with a group of investors soaking in their admiration. He thought he had just been handed a golden goose. He thought he was the undisputed king of the Seattle shipping industry. He had no idea he had just inherited a company that was already marked for death. The sun beat down on the manicured hedges, but I felt ice in my veins. I stood on the periphery of the party, clutching the cheap strap of my purse. Inside that bag rested the financial execution order for my family. I watched Julian throw his head back in laughter. surrounded by men wearing imported suits and expensive watches. He spent the last 3 years attending fraternity formals and networking events in Palo Alto. I spent the last 3 years in a cage of my own making. My gaze drifted past the white catering tents and the string quartet. I was not really seeing the celebration anymore. I was seeing the harsh glow of 3 refurbished computer monitors in a dark room. For 36 months, that had been my entire world. Every single weekday at 5 inches the evening, I would clock out of the windowless Hughes Global basement. I would walk 6 blocks in the Seattle rain to catch a crowded city bus. I would unlock the deadbolt on my cramped studio apartment. The unit was located right next to the elevated train tracks. Every 20 minutes, the walls would rattle and the cheap floorboards would shake as the freight cars rolled past. I did not care about the noise. I only cared about the work waiting for me on a plastic folding table. My parents used to hire specialists to fix my broken attention span. They paid professionals to force me to read standard textbooks and take multiple-choice tests. They gave up on me when I could not conform to their rigid academic standards. What they failed to understand is that a brain wired like mine does not lack focus. It simply requires the right target. Once I began translating the tangled mess of commercial trucking routes into clean digital code, a strange phenomenon took over. The clinical term for it is hyperfocus. To me, it felt like stepping into a silent room where everything finally made perfect sense. I did not need to memorize historical dates or recite literature. I needed to build a living, breathing artificial intelligence that could predict traffic weather patterns and human error in real time. I poured cheap instant coffee into a chipped mug. I sat in the dark, illuminated only by the blue light of the screens. From 6:0 inches the evening until 2 inches the morning, I wrote lines of complex code. My fingers cramped from striking the keys. My eyes burned from the glare. I lived on 4 hours of sleep and day-old bakery bread. I sacrificed friendships, weekends, and any semblance of a normal 20s lifestyle. I funneled every ounce of my spatial awareness into the software. I taught the program to think. I taught it to learn the most efficient way to move a heavy freight truck from one side of the country to the other without wasting a single drop of diesel. I named the architecture project Meridian. I knew the severe risks of building this system while employed by my father. If Richard Hughes discovered what I was doing, he would claim legal ownership without hesitation. He would deploy his corporate lawyers to argue that I developed the technology using company resources and internal knowledge. He would take it from me just to hand it to Julian. To protect myself, I gathered my meager savings and hired a faceless online legal service. I established a blind limited liability structure registered in the state of Delaware. I set up encrypted proxy emails and rented secure offshore cloud servers. My name appeared on a single public document. I signed the server leases using a registered agent. To the business world, the brilliant founder of Meridian was a phantom. I went through this grueling physical and mental marathon for one specific reason. Down in the filing room, I had access to the raw data. I processed the numbers my father desperately tried to hide from his country club friends. Hughes Global Logistics was a sinking ship. For months, I had watched my father pace the floors of the executive suites with a clenched jaw. I heard the muffled shouting matches through the heavy mahogany doors of his office. He was fighting with the accounting department on a daily basis. The company was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate. High-interest corporate loans were nearing their maturity dates. Rising fuel costs were devouring the remaining profit margins. The traditional shipping model was dead, and my father was running a desperate shell game to keep the banks from foreclosing on his fleet of trucks. He had placed all his remaining chips on one final gamble. A national retail conglomerate was expanding its footprint across the Pacific Northwest. They were looking to award an exclusive 10-year distribution contract to a single regional carrier. Securing that contract would inject enough upfront capital to save Hughes Global from bankruptcy. It was the only lifeline left to keep the empire afloat. But the retail giant presented a strict, non-negotiable demand. They refused to partner with any shipping vendor that relied on analog systems. To win the bid, a logistics company had to integrate with next-generation tracking software. The retailer required automated rerouting, predictive fuel analysis, and real-time delivery metrics. They demanded the precise algorithmic perfection that my father had explicitly ordered me to throw in the trash a year earlier. A sharp squeal of microphone feedback dragged my attention back to the garden party. I blinked against the bright afternoon sun. Richard Hughes was standing on the wooden stage again. He held a fresh glass of bourbon in his right hand. His face was flushed, a deep shade of red, from the liquor. He slurred his words just a fraction. But his bravado remained intact. He draped a heavy arm over Julian's shoulder and gestured to the crowd. "Listen to me, everyone." My father boomed over the speakers. The wealthy investors stopped their conversations and turned toward the stage. You read the industry reports. You know what is at stake in this current market. There is a very lucrative retail contract floating in the wind right now, and I know the rumors are swirling that Hughes Global is falling behind the times. The manicured lawn grew quiet. A few of the older board members exchanged nervous glances. The tension in the air was palpable. My father smiled, displaying a row of bright white veneers. "Let me put those rumors to rest right here and now," he continued. His voice echoed off the walls of the sprawling estate. "We are not just going to win that contract. We are going to lock it down for the next decade. The old way of doing business is over." On Monday morning, Julian takes the helm, and I am proud to announce that his very first act as Chief Executive Officer will be unveiling a strategic technology acquisition. The investors leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "We have our sights set on a new software platform," my father declared. "A brilliant logistics startup that is going to modernize our entire fleet overnight. We are going to buy this technology outright, and we are going to use it to secure the retail deal. Julian is going to lead the charge into the future." Julian puffed out his chest. He offered the crowd a solemn, determined nod, playing the role of the tech-savvy young visionary. The investors broke into relieved applause. They raised their glasses to the new CEO, cheering for a victory that did not exist. I stood frozen by the tall hedge. The afternoon heat suddenly felt like ice water running through my veins. I did not look at the stage anymore. I looked down at my cheap faux leather purse. My father was lying to his financial backers. Julian did not have a software and company lined up to purchase. He had not signed a term sheet or negotiated a buyout. He was bluffing to keep the investors from panicking and pulling their capital. He was promising them an immediate technological miracle to keep the illusion of power alive. There was only one logistics software platform in the entire region capable of handling the retail giant's demands. There was only one artificial intelligence startup generating rumors in the commercial freight sector. Julian was going to walk into the corporate office on Monday morning and use the last of the company funds to hunt down the anonymous founder of Meridian. He was betting the entire survival of his inherited empire on acquiring the exact algorithm I had just created. He was hunting for a ghost. He was plotting a hostile takeover of a company he thought belonged to a desperate tech nerd. He had no idea the ghost was standing 50 feet away, holding a certified cashier's check for $55 million. I traced the outline of the envelope through the fabric of my bag. My family built a trap to save themselves, and they were about to walk right into my jaws. This is exactly the type of tension and pacing we need. You have captured the arrogant blindness of the family perfectly. Here is part 5. The applause rippling across the Bellevue estate was meant to be the final seal on Julian's coronation. Investors clinked their crystal glasses. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of fresh hors d'oeuvres. My father stood on the wooden stage, soaking in the adulation. He raised his bourbon glass, one more time to toast his own fabricated triumph. He had successfully sold the crowd a fairy tale about a phantom technology acquisition. The wealthy men and women in the front row bought the lie without hesitation. They wanted to believe their money was safe. Then a sharp mechanical ringing sliced through the smooth notes of the jazz band. It was a jarring sound. My father kept a secondary cell phone in his jacket pocket. It was a dedicated line, strictly reserved for his chief operating officer. Marcus was a grizzled, logistics veteran who ran the actual day-to-day shipping floor, while my father played 18 holes of golf with bankers. Marcus never called the private line during a weekend celebration, unless a disaster was unfolding in real time. Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket. He checked the caller ID. I watched his confident smile falter. He turned his back to the crowd and stepped down from the stage. He moved toward the shadow of a large oak tree to take the call in private. The investors went back to their conversations, but a few of the older board members kept their eyes locked on the outgoing chief executive. I stood motionless by the catered dessert table. I picked up a glass of sparkling water. I kept my eyes fixed on my father. I could not hear the words coming through the receiver, but I did not need audio to understand the conversation. I watched the physical collapse of the man who had controlled my entire life. Richard stopped pacing. His shoulders slumped forward. The hand holding his bourbon glass began to tremble so fiercely that amber liquid sloshed over the rim and stained his expensive leather shoes. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of wet ash. He looked like a man who had just been told his parachute failed to open. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He did not move for several long seconds. He just stared blankly at the manicured grass. A senior board member approached him. The older man placed a hand on my father's shoulder and asked a question. Richard turned around. His facade was gone. The panic was raw and visible. Word spread instantly. The relaxed atmosphere of the garden party evaporated. The string quartet continued playing, but the wealthy guests stopped smiling. Whispers cut through the crowd like a cold wind. Julian noticed the shift in the air. He handed his drink to a fraternity brother and marched over to the oak tree. He grabbed our father by the arm, demanding to know what was wrong. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I drifted closer to the edge of the VIP section, keeping myself hidden behind a tall floral arrangement. The voices carrying across the lawn were no longer hushed. They were strained and frantic. The retail giant called my father told Julian. His voice cracked. He sounded out of breath. The procurement officers just finished their quarterly vendor review. They changed the terms of the bidding process. Julian tightened his jaw. What does that mean? Dad, we offered them the lowest freight rate in the entire Pacific Northwest. We promised them priority dispatch. It is not about the freight rate anymore. Richard snapped. The panic in his eyes hardened into desperate anger. Marcus said the retailer is upgrading their entire national supply chain. They will not sign a contract with any regional carrier using analog tracking. They gave Marcus a hard deadline. If Hughes Global cannot prove full integration with a specific artificial intelligence platform by Tuesday morning, they are pulling our bid. They are walking away from the table. The board members, standing nearby, gasped. Losing that bid meant corporate death. The banks would freeze the credit lines by Friday. What platform? Julian asked. His voice betrayed a sudden tremor of fear. What exactly are they demanding we use? My father ran a shaking hand through his thinning hair. Meridian Logistics. He spat the name out as if it were poison. The retailer claims Meridian is the new gold standard for automated routing. They told Marcus that any shipping company not running on Meridian architecture will be obsolete in 6 months. Richard looked wildly around the circle of executives. Does anyone here even know what the hell Meridian Logistics is? The board members shook their heads. They traded clueless glances. These were men who still dictated memos to their secretaries and printed out emails. They were entirely disconnected from the shifting tectonic plates of the modern technology sector. They built their fortunes on diesel trucks and warehouse real estate. A phantom software company had just materialized out of thin air and placed a gun to the head of their regional empire. Julian stepped forward. He recognized the imminent threat to his brand new throne. The investors were watching him closely. They needed to see leadership. They needed the Stanford genius to provide a solution before their stock portfolios crashed. Julian squared his shoulders. He plastered on a mask of supreme confidence. It was the same arrogant expression he used when he belittled me in the grand foyer. Everyone calm down, Julian ordered. He pitched his voice loud enough for the anxious crowd to hear. This changes nothing. It is actually a perfect opportunity. Richard stared at his son in disbelief. An opportunity. They are accelerating the deadline to Tuesday. Julian, we do not own this software. We do not even know who built it. Julian let out a dismissive scoff. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive linen suit. Dad, it is just a startup. It is probably a couple of desperate tech geeks operating out of a rented garage. In Bellevue, they build these little algorithms, hoping a major player like us will toss them a bone. This is exactly what I was talking about on stage. This is the acquisition we need. The board members leaned in, desperate for any trace of hope. I will handle this, Julian declared. He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the key financial backers. I take over as Chief Executive Officer on Monday morning at 8. My first order of business will be locating the founder of Meridian. We will sit them down in our boardroom, and we will buy them out. We have the emergency reserve capital. We will throw a few $1 million on the table and swallow their entire operation before the Tuesday deadline. By Wednesday, the retail contract will be signed, and Hughes Global will own the new industry standard. The older executives let out a collective sigh of relief. They clapped Julian on the back, praising his quick thinking and aggressive business instincts. They believed him. They trusted the pedigree of his degree and the confidence in his posture. I stood quietly near the dessert table. The air felt incredibly still. I watched my brother puff out his chest and accept the premature praise. He relied on a predictable, outdated playbook. He assumed every problem could be solved by throwing a fraction of his inherited wealth at it. He categorized the founder of Meridian as a nameless, desperate geek who would eagerly bow down to the almighty Hughes family for a meager payday. Julian was making a binding public vow to execute a hostile takeover of a software company that no longer existed on the open market. He was promising to buy a technology asset that I had just sold to a global corporate titan for $55 million. He planned to use the depleted Hughes Global Emergency Fund to bully a phantom out of Slan. He had no concept of the predator waiting for him in the shadows. Apex Tech did not entertain buyouts from dying regional shipping companies. Apex Tech devoured them. And my brother was about to march into a war room holding a plastic knife. I placed my empty water glass on a passing waiter's tray. The party was beginning to resume its false festive rhythm. But the underlying tension remained. I turned away from the crowd and looked toward the long curving driveway of the estate. A row of luxury vehicles sat idling near the stone gates. The valet attendants hurried back and forth, retrieving keys for the early departures. Standing perfectly still near a black town car was the tall, silver-haired man. Mr. Pierce. He was not looking at his phone. He was not speaking to the valet. He was staring directly across the expansive lawn, cutting through the crowd of socialites and executives to find me. I met his chaza. The distance between us was vast, but the communication was crystal clear. He knew exactly what had just transpired near the oak tree. He knew the trap was set. The retail giant had played their assigned role perfectly. The timeline was accelerated. The pressure was locked in. The silver-haired lawyer did not smile. He simply offered a single, slow nod of his head. It was an acknowledgement of the battlefield to come. He opened the rear door of the town car and slipped inside. Fading into the tinted glass, I pressed my hand against the side of my cheap purse, feeling the hard outline of the heavy envelope through the fabric. Monday morning was going to be a revelation. My brother was going to demand a meeting with the supreme architect of his downfall, and I was going to make sure he got exactly what he asked for. The weekend vanished into a blur of restless anticipation. When my alarm clock blared at 5:30 on Monday morning, I did not hit snooze. I dressed in my standard office attire, a modest gray pencil skirt and a plain white blouse. I took the crowded city bus downtown and swiped my security badge at the employee entrance of the Hughes Global Corporate Tower right at 7:45. The building felt different today. Usually Monday mornings were a slow, groggy crawl as the administrative staff settled in with their coffee. Today, the atmosphere was electric with panic. I bypassed the main lobby elevators and took the freight stairs down to the basement. I sat at my metal desk and turned on my outdated computer. Above me, through the ceiling tiles, I could hear the heavy thud of footsteps. The executive suites on the top floor were in a state of uncontrolled chaos. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly what was happening. My father and Julian were running a desperate triage operation. The retail giant's accelerated Tuesday deadline was acting like a vice grip on the company's oxygen supply. Richard Hughes had likely spent his entire Sunday calling in every favor he possessed, trying to trace the digital footprint of Meridian Logistics. He would have failed. My blind corporate structure was impenetrable to regional shipping executives. At exactly 8:15, the intercom unit on my desk buzzed with an angry mechanical hum. I pressed the worn plastic button. Vivian Julian's voice crackled through the speaker. He did not say good morning. He did not ask if I was busy. Get up here right now. The legal team is assembling in the main boardroom. I need 4 black coffees, 2 espressos, and a stack of standard non-disclosure agreements printed on the heavy stock paper. Do not drag your feet today. I am executing a hostile takeover, and I cannot have you slowing down my momentum. I released the button. I did not bother replying. I took my time formatting the non-disclosure agreements. I knew the documents were entirely useless. You cannot force a hostile takeover on a company you cannot afford to buy. But I printed them anyway, stacking the crisp pages neatly into a leather portfolio. I walked over to the break room and prepared the coffee tray, carefully balancing the porcelain cups. I rode the elevator up to the executive floor. The door slid open to reveal a scene of corporate desperation. Paralegals were sprinting down the carpeted hallways, carrying stacks of financial records. Richard was standing outside his office, yelling at his chief financial officer about liquidating short-term assets to free up cash. Julian was pacing the floor of the reception area. He wore a sharp navy suit tailored to project maximum authority. He looked like a man preparing for a fight. He was absolutely certain he would win. He was practicing his intimidation tactics, flexing his jaw and checking his reflection in the glass doors. I stood near the receptionist's desk holding the heavy coffee tray. Julian glanced in my direction and sneered. Put the tray in the boardroom. Vivian, he commanded, and stay out of the way. When the founder of Meridian arrives, I want you invisible. I am about to tear the startup apart and buy the scraps for pennies. I do not need my slow sister distracting the target. Before I could walk away, the private elevator chimed. The heavy steel doors parted with a soft hiss. The receptionist sat up straight. She adjusted her headset and looked at the visitor. "May I help you?" "Sir," she asked. A man stepped onto the executive floor. He carried a sleek carbon fiber briefcase. His silver hair caught the recessed lighting. His bespoke gray suit was immaculate, projecting a quiet, lethal confidence that instantly sucked the air out of the room. It was Mr. Pierce. He did not look at me. He walked directly to the reception desk. "Good morning," he said. His voice was a calm, raisonnable baritone. "I am here representing Meridian Logistics. I understand the executive team is expecting a meeting regarding an acquisition." Julian stopped pacing. His eyes widened slightly, taking in the formidable appearance of the man standing in his lobby. This was not the desperate tech geek Julian had envisioned. This man did not look like someone who operated out of a garage. But Julian recovered quickly. His arrogance overrode his instincts. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest to reassert his dominance. He marched across the lobby and extended his hand. "I am Julian Hughes," he declared, projecting his voice so the paralegals could hear. "I am the chief executive officer here. You must be the outside counsel for Meridian. I am glad you had the sense to show up early." "Mr." Pierce looked at Julian's outstretched hand for a long moment before finally accepting the handshake. It was a brief clinical gesture. "Let me be clear right out of the gate," Julian continued, dropping his voice into a calculated, predatory tone. "We are operating on an accelerated timeline today. Hughes Global is prepared to make a very generous cash offer to acquire your client's entire algorithm. We want full ownership of the intellectual property. If you try to drag out these negotiations, we will simply build the software ourselves and bury your client in litigation. So, let us skip the posturing and get down to a dollar amount." Mr. Pierce did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted his grip on his briefcase. "Mr. Hughes, there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding regarding the nature of my visit today." Pierce replied smoothly, "I am not here to negotiate a buyout. Meridian Logistics is no longer available for purchase." Julian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He crossed his arms over his chest. "Do not play hardball with me, lawyer. Every startup has a price. Name the figure. My family has deep pockets and we are highly motivated this morning. Your family does not have the capital required for this conversation." "Mr. Pierce stated. His tone was suddenly devoid of any polite pretense. It was cold, hard fact. "I am the lead corporate counsel for Apex Tech. Over the weekend, my firm facilitated the full acquisition of Meridian Logistics. The platform is now the exclusive property of Apex." The color drained from Julian's face so fast, he looked physically ill. The arrogant smirk vanished entirely. He took a staggering step backward. "Apex Tech," Julian whispered. The name landed like a physical blow. The technology sector giant did not negotiate with regional shipping companies. They annihilated them. If Apex owned the routing software, the retail giant's Tuesday deadline was suddenly an execution order. Hughes Global could not afford to buy a software division from Apex. They could barely afford their own diesel fuel. My father, having heard the commotion, stepped out of his office. Richard Hughes walked slowly toward the reception area. His eyes locked on the silver-haired lawyer. "What is going on here?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling slightly. "Who is this man?" Julian. Julian could barely speak. He swallowed hard. "Dad. He represents Apex Tech. They bought the routing software over the weekend. They own Meridian." Richard grabbed the edge of the reception desk to steady himself. The reality of the situation crushed the breath out of him. The 10-year retail contract, the lifeline of the entire Hughes legacy, was evaporating right in front of his eyes. However, Mr. Pierce interjected, cutting through the silence. Apex Tech is aware of your pressing deadline with the retail conglomerate. We are not entirely unreasonable. We are willing to discuss a licensing agreement. We will allow Hughes Global to integrate with the Meridian platform, ensuring you secure your retail bid tomorrow. Julian exhaled a ragged breath. The color returned to his cheeks. A licensing deal was not ideal, but it meant survival. It meant he could still play the hero on his first day as CEO. Fine, Julian snapped, trying to reclaim his shattered authority. We will license it. Drop the paperwork. Name your percentage and let us get this over with. Mr. Pierce shook his head slowly. The terms of the licensing agreement are highly unorthodox. Mr. Hughes, Apex Tech, requires a very specific signature before we authorize the integration. We need the original creator and supreme architect of the Meridian software to personally sign off on a partnership with Hughes Global. Julian threw his hands up in frustration. His temper flared, masking his desperation. This is ridiculous. Apex bought the company. You own the rights. Why do we need the original creator to sign off? It was a contingency written into the buyout contract. Mr. Pierce explained smoothly. The architect retains veto power over all legacy logistics partnerships. If the creator does not approve of your management style or your corporate ethics, they can block the integration. If they block it, you default on your retail bid tomorrow. Julian's face flushed bright red. He slammed his hand down on the receptionist's desk, causing the phone to rattle in its cradle. I do not have time for these Silicon Valley games, Julian shouted. I will not negotiate my family's survival through a messenger. If this anonymous creator holds the keys to my company, then you better bring them into this building right now. I demand to speak directly to the CEO of Meridian. Mr. Pierce did not react to the outburst. He maintained perfect stillness. A thin, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his phone. He did not dial a number. He simply tapped the screen once, sending a single pre-programmed message. That will not be a problem. Mr. Hughes Pierce said quietly. I was standing 3 feet behind Julian. I felt my phone buzz in the pocket of my gray pencil skirt. I let the coffee tray rest on the edge of the desk. I did not say a word as I walked past my brother and pushed open the heavy glass doors to the executive boardroom. Holding the tray of black coffees and espressos, Julian and my father stormed in right behind me. Mr. Pierce followed them at a measured, calm pace. Neither my father nor my brother paid any attention to me. I was simply part of the office furniture. I was the silent administrative assistant carrying their morning beverages. I walked over to the mahogany credenza near the window and carefully set the tray down. I did not leave the room. I stood quietly against the far wall, blending into the shadows. The boardroom was designed to intimidate rivals. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. The long oval table was carved from a single piece of dark walnut. Julian immediately marched to the head of the table, taking the seat of power. Richard sat directly to his right. His breathing was shallow and uneven. The impending doom of the retail contract deadline hung over him like a dark cloud. Mr. Pierce remained standing on the opposite side of the room. He placed his carbon fiber briefcase on the table and unlatched it. Julian did not wait for the lawyer to sit down. My brother opened his leather portfolio and pulled out a crisp sheet of paper. He slid the document across the polished walnut. It came to a stop right in front of Mr. Pierce, let us drop the corporate theater. Julian commanded. His voice echoed off the acoustic paneling. I know you said Apex Tech bought the software over the weekend, but I know how these shell games work. You are a proxy. You are here to drive up the price. I am not playing along. That paper contains a formal binding cash offer for $5 million. That is my final number. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. We are offering you a golden parachute, Richard added, trying to project his old intimidating presence. Take the $5 million and walk away. If you try to hold us hostage over this retail deadline, I will deploy every corporate lawyer in this city. I will tie Meridian up in so much litigation. Your developers will be bankrupt before they ever write another line of code. We own the logistics sector in this region. I watched my family from the corner of the room. They were running a textbook bluff. They did not have $5 million in Tuime. Liquid capital. They were planning to drain the last remaining credit line to pay off a startup they believed was desperate for cash. They were threatening to destroy a company they knew nothing about. Mr. Pierce did not touch the paper. He did not even look at the typed numbers. He simply looked at Julian with an expression of clinical pity. Mr. Hughes, you seem to be operating under a severe delusion regarding your leverage in this room, Pierce said. His baritone voice was smooth and unbothered. You do not own the logistics sector in this region anymore. Apex Tech does. And Apex does not engage in bidding wars with distressed regional carriers. Pierce reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single red folder. He laid it flat on the walnut table. My firm finalized the acquisition of Meridian Logistics on Saturday night. Pice continued. The transaction is complete. The funds have been cleared and transferred. Your offer of $5 million is not just insulting, it is a mathematical impossibility. Apex Tech purchased the routing algorithm for $55 million. The word struck the room like a physical shockwave. Richard choked on his next breath. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. $55 million. The number was incomprehensible to him. It was more capital than Hughes Global had generated in the last 5 years combined. The threat of burying Meridian in litigation evaporated. You cannot sue a tech giant that carries that kind of liquid weight. Julian stared at the red folder. His arrogant posture collapsed. He sank back into the leather executive chair. His strategy of intimidation was useless. He was a man holding a water pistol aimed at a battleship. Without owning that software, the retail mega contract is officially dead. Richard whispered. The realization drained the last drop of fight from his voice. We will default on the fleet loans by the end of the week. The banks will take the trucks. The banks will take everything. My father was staring directly at his own ruin. He had bet the entire legacy on a retail deal he could no longer secure. Mr. Pierce let the silence stretch. He allowed the executives to feel the full crushing weight of their failure before offering a sliver of hope. As I stated in the lobby, Apex Tech is willing to extend a licensing agreement, Pice said cleanly. We are not interested in running heavy freight trucks. We build the artificial intelligence and we lease it to the operators. We can grant Hughes Global full integration access to the Meridian platform. You can take our licensing terms to your retail client tomorrow and secure your 10-year bid. Julian sat up. His eyes darted around the room. A lifeline had been tossed into the freezing water. He grabbed it without hesitation. We will take the license, Julian said quickly. He tried to smooth his tie, pretending he was back in control. Whatever your annual fee is, we will write it into the new budget. Send the contracts over immediately. Pice shook his head. You are forgetting the contingency I mentioned outside Mr. Hughes. Apex Tech honors the original creators of the platforms we acquire. The architect of Meridian retained absolute veto power over all licensing partnerships. Your company has a reputation in this city. Your father is known for ruthless, outdated management tactics. The creator wants to ensure their code is not deployed by a company that mismanages its resources. Julian ground his teeth together. The frustration boiled over. He slapped his hand against the leather armrest. This is an absurd business practice. Julian shouted. You do not let a software developer dictate corporate partnerships. You own the code. Just sign the paper. We are out of time. I cannot override the contract. Pice replied. The architect must personally review your operational structure and approve the partnership. If the creator says no, Apex Tech walks away. Hughes Global defaults. Julian stood up from his chair. His face was flushed with frantic anger. He pointed a finger at the silver-haired lawyer. Then bring this arrogant Silicon Valley tech bro into my boardroom right now. Julian demanded. Where is he? Is he hiding in his car downstairs? Is he waiting for me to beg? Because if he tries to extort my family, I will drag his name through the Seattle business press. I will make sure nobody in this city ever works with him again. Bring the CEO of Meridian into this room right now. Pierce did not flinch at the threats. He calmly reached down and closed the latches on his carbon fiber briefcase. That is not necessary. Mr. Hughes, Pierce said quietly. The chief executive officer of Meridian Logistics has been in the room this entire time. Julian froze. His extended finger slowly dropped. Richard turned his head, scanning the empty chairs around the long oval table. There was no one else in the room. Just Julian. Richard, Mr. Pierce, and the administrative assistant standing quietly in the corner. I stepped away from the wall. I picked up my cheap faux leather purse from the floor. I walked over to the credenza and picked up one of the black coffees Julian had ordered me to fetch. The ceramic cup rattled slightly against the saucer. I walked past the silver-haired lawyer. I walked past my father, who was staring at me with a look of utter confusion. I walked directly to the opposite end of the long mahogany table. I pulled out the heavy leather executive chair, the chair reserved for the chairman of the board. I sat down. I placed my coffee on the polished wood. I folded my hands and looked directly at my brother. Julian was staring at me. His mouth hung open. His brain was failing to process the visual information in front of him. I waited for the silence to stretch. I let them look at the slow girl they had banished to the basement. I let them look at the woman holding the execution order for their entire empire. Hello, Julian, I said softly. I believe we have a licensing deal to discuss. 5 seconds is an eternity inside a corporate boardroom. I counted each passing second by the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock. Standing in the corner of the executive suite, Julian sat frozen at the head of the mahogany table. His eyes darted from me to Mr. Perry, Pierce, and then back to me. His brain simply refused to process the visual data. He had spent his entire life categorizing me as a defective piece of the family machinery. Accepting me as a Silicon Valley architect required a structural cognitive collapse. So his mind protected itself with denial. Julian let out a sharp bark of laughter. It was a forced, patronizing sound that echoed off the acoustic wood. Paneling. He shook his head and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at me with the familiar condescension he used when explaining basic instructions to the valet staff. Vivan. What are you doing? He sighed. His voice carried a weary, exasperated edge. This is a closed-door executive negotiation. You cannot just sit at the chairman's seat because you brought the morning beverages. Put the tray on the credenza and go back down to the basement. We are dealing with a critical vendor issue, and we do not have time for your confusion today. I did not move. I did not break eye contact. I reached out and took a slow, deliberate sip from my ceramic cup. The dark roast was bitter, but the moment tasted like victory. Mr. Pierce remained standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silver-haired lawyer did not say a word to correct my brother. He simply watched the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a scientist, observing a predictable experiment. The silence stretched again, growing heavier with every passing moment. Julian dropped his hand from his face. The fake smile vanished. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the walnut table. His posture shifted from patronizing sibling to a cold corporate commander. "Did you hear me?" "Vivian," he demanded. The volume of his voice rose sharply. I said, "Get out of this room right now. You are embarrassing yourself. And you are embarrassing the company in front of outside counsel. Leave the coffees and get out before I have security escort you to the freight elevator." I set my cup down on the saucer. The porcelain clicked sharply against the wood. I reached for the cheap faux leather portfolio I had carried up from the basement. It was the same worn folder I used to hold the paper, shipping manifests every single week. I unsnapped the metal clasp. I did not speak. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of crisp, thick documents. The first paper was the official United States Patent and Trademark Office registration. I slid it across the long table. The document glided over the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of my father. Richard looked down. He did not want to read it. He squinted at the formal government seal and the dense block text. His eyes scanned the summary paragraph describing an artificial intelligence routing algorithm designed for commercial freight logistics. Then his gaze dropped to the line designating the registered inventor. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stopped, breathing. The name printed on the federal patent was Vivian Hughes. I pulled out the second document. It was the certificate of incorporation for a Delaware limited liability company named Meridian Logistics. I slid it down the table. It came to rest right next to the patent. The registered owner and sole managing member was Vivian Hughes. I pulled out the final document. It was the finalized buyout confirmation from Apex Tech. It detailed the transfer of all software assets in exchange for $55 million. It bore the signatures of the Apex Board of Directors and the signature of the Meridian founder, Vivian Hughes. I watched the exact moment my father realized his reality was a fabrication. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. He looked at the papers and then he looked at me. His worldview fractured. For 26 years, he had curated a narrative where Julian was the genetic lottery winner. Richard funded expensive tutors and celebrated every mediocre milestone his son achieved. He hid me in the windowless filing room because my presence contradicted his image of a flawless corporate dynasty. He told his country club friends I was slow. He told his investors I was unacademic. He told me I was incapable of complex thought. Now the federal government and the most powerful tech conglomerate in the Pacific Northwest were officially declaring him wrong. My father stared at the daughter he had thrown away. He realized the basement admin was the sole architect of the technology that had just rendered his life work obsolete. I built a digital empire while sorting his trash. Vivian, Richard whispered. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its usual booming authority. His hands trembled as he hovered his fingers over the patent seal. How is this possible? You do not know how to code. You cannot even read a standard financial report. I learned how to code 3 years ago. Dad, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. It turns out I am exceptionally good at reading financial reports, especially the ones you tried to hide. From the accounting department, I saw the deadhead fuel waste. I saw the routing inefficiencies. I built an algorithmic system to fix it. Julian snapped out of his paralysis. The shock rapidly fermented into a blind. Toxic rage. The Stanford graduate was suffocating under the weight of his own humiliation. He snatched the papers off the table. He crumpled the edges of the patent in his fists as his eyes darted across the paragraphs. He was hunting for a loophole. He desperately searched for a mistake. A forged signature. Ora, legal technicality that would prove I was just a pawn in a larger game. This is a joke. Julian sneered. His voice cracked with frantic panic. His chest heaved as he shoved the papers back toward our father. She did not build this. She is a filing clerk. She probably met some desperate developer online and let him use her name to set up a shell company. This is a fraud scheme. Mr. Pierce stepped forward from the shadows. The lawyer adjusted his suit jacket, his expression hardening into stone. I can assure you, Mr. Hughes, there is no fraud. Pice stated coldly. Apex Tech conducted a rigorous 3-month due diligence process before finalizing a $55 million acquisition. We audited every single line of code. We traced the digital footprint back to its exact origin. Vivian Hughes is the sole developer and creator of the Meridian architecture. Her technical proficiency was tested and verified by our senior engineering team. She is a recognized SONT in spatial data processing. The word savant echoed in the silent boardroom. Julian recoiled as if he had been physically struck. My father bypassed the shock and went straight to his baseline survival instinct. Richard Hughes was a man who only knew how to operate through dominance and fear. When cornered, he attacked. The sadness and confusion vanished from his face, replaced by a familiar, ruthless glare. Richard slammed his closed fist onto the mahogany table. The coffee cups rattled on their saucers. You ungrateful little thief. Richard roared. The veins in his neck bulged against his white collar. You think you can outsmart me. You think you can walk into my boardroom and hold my company hostage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You built that software while you were on my payroll. He shouted. His voice echoed off the glass walls. You used my shipping manifests. You used my proprietary rote data to train your little algorithm. That makes it company property. You stole corporate intellectual property on company time. Julian caught the lifeline his father threw. The panic left his eyes, replaced by a calculating gleam. He is right, Julian said. He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Trying to reclaim the high ground. You just handed us the evidence. Vivian, you breached your employment contract. You have zero legal claim to Meridian. It belongs to Hughes Global Logistics. We do not need to license the software from Apex Tech. We are going to sue you for corporate espionage. We are going to take the entire $55 million, and we are going to press criminal charges against you. You will be lucky if you do not spend the next 10 years in a federal prison cell. They thought they had me trapped. They fell back on their wealth and their expensive legal retainers, assuming they could bully me into submission. They expected me to crumble under the threat of a devastating lawsuit. They expected the slow girl to panic and beg for forgiveness to hand over the keys to the kingdom just to avoid a courtroom. I did not panic. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. I looked at my father and my brother. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the calculated expression of an architect watching a demolition charge detonate exactly on schedule. I had spent 3 years preparing for this specific confrontation. I knew my father would claim ownership the second he realized the software possessed tangible value. I anticipated the intellectual property threat before I ever wrote the first line of digital code. I reached back into my cheap faux leather portfolio. I had one more document to share, and it was going to destroy their final illusion of control. I kept my eyes locked on my father as the threat of federal prison hung in the air. A younger version of me would have shattered under that kind of pressure. The old Vivian would have cried and begged for forgiveness. But the woman sitting in the chairman's seat had spent 1,000 nights preparing for this exact moment. I did not just build a logistics algorithm, I built a fortress. Around it, I reached into my portfolio one more time. I bypassed the federal patent and the buyout contract. I withdrew a thick stack of printed spreadsheets and a single crinkled piece of paper. I placed the spreadsheets on the walnut table first. My father leaned over, trying to read the columns of data. "You want to sue me for corporate espionage?" "Dad," I asked, keeping my tone conversational. "You want to claim I built Meridian on your dime?" Those spreadsheets are the certified digital access logs from my writings. Personal computer. I hired an independent forensic accounting firm to verify every single keystroke. I tapped my finger against the top page. The forensic audit proves that I never wrote a single line of code on Hughes Global property. I never used a company server. I did all the programming on a refurbished laptop I bought at a pawn shop because my administrative salary did not cover retail electronics. The logs show my network activity starting at 11 at night and ending at 3:00 inches the morning. I built my empire strictly off the clock. Julian sneered, dismissing the spreadsheets with a wave of his hand. "That proves nothing," he snapped. "You still used our proprietary routing data. You stole our shipping manifests to train your system. That is theft of trade secrets. We still own the intellectual property." I turned my attention to my brother. I picked up the final crinkled piece of paper. It was an internal human resources form. It had been folded and unfolded so many times, the creases were worn thin. "Do you remember the summer after your first year at Stanford, Julian?" I asked. "You came back to Seattle for a month. Dad gave you a temporary corner office so you could pretend to be an executive. You spent most of your time browsing golf catalogs and leaving early for drinks." Julian tightened his jaw. He did not answer. He stared at the crinkled paper in my hand. A shadow of uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. I reminded him of a Tuesday afternoon in July 2 years ago. I walked into his temporary office, holding a standard Hughes Global Moonlighting waiver. The company had a strict policy regarding side projects. Employees had to declare outside ventures to ensure Hughes Global was not liable for any open-source copyright violations or server costs. "I told you I was coding a little hobby project," I explained to the silent boardroom. "I told you it was just a routing game to pass the time in the basement. I asked you to review the form and sign it as an acting executive so human resources would not penalize me." I slid the crinkled paper across the table. It stopped right in front of Julian. "You were very annoyed that I interrupted your phone call." I continued. "You told me you did not have time to read documents regarding my childish hobbies. You told me my little game was worthless. And then, to get me out of your office, you picked up your expensive fountain pen and you signed the bottom line." Julian looked down at the human resources waiver. His face turned a sickening shade of pale green. There, on the bottom right corner, was his distinct sweeping signature. He had signed the official corporate release form. The document legally untethered my project from Hughes Global Logistics. It explicitly stated that the company waived all rights claims and interests in the intellectual property known as Project Meridian. He had signed away any legal avenue to sue me just to avoid a minor administrative liability. "You legally handed me sole ownership of a $55 million asset." "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet whisper. "You gave it away because you were too arrogant to read a single piece of paper handed to you by your slow sister." Julian could not speak. The realization hit him with physical force. He slumped back in his chair. He looked at his own signature. He was the golden boy. He was the Stanford genius. And he had just provided the exact documentation necessary to defeat his own corporate espionage lawsuit. "Mr." Pierce stepped up to the edge of the table. The lawyer looked down at the waiver and offered a curt nod. Apex Tech legal counsel already reviewed that specific document. Mr. Pierce informed my father. It is ironclad. You have no legal standing to challenge the ownership of Meridian Logistics. Any lawsuit you file will be dismissed with prejudice at your own expense. Richard Hughes stared at the waiver. The fight drained out of him. The blustering tyrant who had controlled our family for decades suddenly looked very small. The legal threats were dead. The intimidation tactics were useless. He was stripped of every weapon he usually wielded. The silence in the boardroom stretched as the harsh mathematical reality settled over my father. He did not have the software. He could not steal it. He could not sue for it. Without the software license, the retail conglomerate would pull their 10-year contract bid by tomorrow morning. Without the retail contract, Hughes Global Logistics would miss their next massive debt payment. The creditors would begin seizing the freight trucks in exactly 48 hours. The empire was not just crumbling. It was 48 hours away from being erased from the map entirely. My father slowly raised his head. He looked at me. The anger was gone, replaced by a sudden cloying desperation. It was a manipulative shift I had never seen him attempt before. He realized he could not command me as his employee. He had to appeal to me as his daughter. Vivian, he said, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. We are family. You have made your point. You proved you are smarter than we thought. You won the game, but this is the real world now. We are talking about the survival of the Hughes legacy. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward my end of the table. He held his hands out, palms up in a gesture of surrender. You have $55 million. Vivian, he pleaded, you do not need this licensing leverage. We are 48 hours away from defaulting on our loans. I am asking you to sign the integration rights over to us. Let Julian take the software to the retail meeting tomorrow. Let us save the company I built with my bare hands. I looked at his outstretched hands. I did not say a word. My father took another step closer. His tone grew more urgent, dipping into toxic guilt. You owe us this. Vivian, we raised you. We put a roof over your head when you were struggling. We kept you on the payroll here when you had nowhere else to go. You cannot turn your back on your own blood. Sign the licensing rights. Do the right thing for your family. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a gold pen. He set it gently on the table next to my coffee cup. He was waiting for me to revert to my old programming. He was waiting for the obedient basement clerk to fold under the weight of family duty. I looked at the gold pen. Then I looked into my father's desperate eyes. You did not raise me. Dad, I said, my voice echoing cleanly across the quiet room. You tolerated me. You kept me on the payroll so you could hide your defective child in a cinder block room where your country club friends would never see her. You did not build this legacy for us. You built it for Julian. I picked up the gold pen. I held it between my fingers, feeling the heavy, expensive metal. Meridian Logistics belongs to Apex Tech. I stated, I retain the exclusive right to approve their partnerships. And I do not partner with dying companies managed by arrogant men who do not read their own paperwork. I dropped the gold pen. It clattered sharply against the walnut wood and rolled off the table, hitting the carpeted floor. The answer is no. I said, I will not sign the integration rights. Hughes Global will not secure the retail contract. Your empire dies on Friday. The desperate facade vanished from my father's face. The rejection sparked a fire in the room that no legal document could contain. My brother stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. The corporate negotiation was officially over. The all-out family war had just begun, and they were about to call in their most venomous reinforcement. Julian knocked his heavy leather chair backward as he stood up. The heavy wooden leg scraped violently against the carpet. He drew in a ragged breath, preparing to unleash a torrent of unhinged rage. He was ready to scream, but the sound never materialized. The frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom burst open. My mother stepped over the threshold. Beatrice Hughes wore a pristine cream-cold cashmere sweater and a string of authentic saltwater pearls. Her blonde hair was styled in a flawless, rigid blowout. She looked like a woman who had just stepped out of an exclusive charity luncheon. But her chest was heaving. She gripped her smartphone so tightly, her knuckles shone stark white. Julian had texted her. During the standoff, he summoned his ultimate protector when his own corporate bullying failed. Beatrice did not look at the silver-haired lawyer standing by the window. She bypassed my father, who was still staring blankly at the crinkled human resources waiver on the table. She ignored Julian. She locked her eyes directly on me. She glided across the room. Her designer heels clicked a sharp, rhythmic cadence against the hardwood border of the floor. As she approached my end of the mahogany table, her posture changed. The frantic tension drained from her shoulders. Her face softened into a mask of profound, gentle concern. She deployed her most dangerous weapon: weaponized empathy. When I was 10 years old, my teachers recommended a specialized learning program to help with my auditory processing delays. The school required parental funding for the extra sessions. My mother flatly refused to write the check. Instead, she used my academic struggles as a potent social currency. She would sit at lavish country club dinners, drinking expensive wine and sighing tragically. She told her wealthy friends how exhausting it was to raise a child who simply could not grasp basic concepts. She played the role of the patient's suffering martyr to perfection. It earned her endless sympathy and admiration. She loved my defects because they elevated her social status. She thrived on being the saintly mother of a broken girl. She brought that exact same saintly persona into the corporate war room. "Vivian, darling," Beatrice purred. Her voice was dripping with a sickly sweet, patronizing warmth. She reached out and placed her manicured hand over mine. Her skin was freezing. The scent of her heavy floral perfume washed over the table, masking the smell of the bitter coffee. Julian texted me that there is a terrible misunderstanding happening up here. My mother continued. She tilted her head, giving me a look of practiced pity. He told me you made a very clever little computer program. We are all so proud of you. Sweetheart, we really are, but you are letting this get out of hand. You are playing a dangerous game with adult matters. I looked at her hand resting on mine. I did not pull away. I wanted to feel the exact temperature of her manipulation. She was minimizing a $55 million tech buyout. She was reducing an industry, disrupting artificial intelligence platform, to a clever little computer program. You need to stop this tantrum. Vivian, she whispered, leaning closer. Her eyes darted to Mr. Pierce and then back to me. You are embarrassing your father in front of outside counsel. You are making Julian anxious on his very first day. We are a family. Family is blood. Money comes and goes. But blood is forever. She squeezed my hand. It was not a gesture of affection. It was a physical command to submit. Your brother worked so hard for his Stanford degree. Beatrice pleaded, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. He earned this chief executive position. He has been waiting for this moment his entire life. Please do not ruin this for him. Do the right thing. Just sign the licensing paper and give your brother the software. Give him a successful first week. Let him have his victory. She asked me to surrender the leverage of my entire creation, simply to stroke my brother's fragile ego. She wanted me to hand over the keys to the future of logistics, so Julian could pretend he did not bankrupt the legacy on day one. I slowly pulled my hand out from under hers. I placed my hands flat on the polished walnut table right next to my smartphone. The screen was dark. With a subtle, deliberate tap of my index finger, I woke the device. I pressed the red icon on the home screen. The voice memo application launched silently. A tiny red dot appeared, indicating the microphone was active and recording. "No," I said. My voice was crisp and devoid of any emotion. Beatrice blinked. The sweet smile froze on her face. "I am not handing over my licensing rights, so Julian can play a successful businessman," I explained clearly. Ensuring the microphone picked up every syllable. "My algorithm is a corporate asset. It is not a graduation gift. I will not subsidize his failure." The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. The saintly mother facade cracked. The illusion of the patient martyr shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Beatrice straightened her posture. The soft concern vanished from her eyes, leaving behind a cold, vicious glare. "You ungrateful, deceitful little girl," Beatrice hissed. Her voice dropped an octave. Stripping away the sugary warmth, the raw venom poured out, of her unfiltered and vile. She leaned over the table, invading my personal space. "We kept a roof over your head," she spat. "We kept you employed when no real company would ever hire someone with your limitations. You slink around in the basement playing on a laptop, while the real men in this family do the actual work. You think you are a genius because you stumbled onto a computer trick. You are not a genius. Vivian, you are a fraud." My father stood frozen. Julian watched with a vindictive smirk. They let her tear into me because they lacked the ammunition to do it themselves. "You got lucky," Beatrice continued, her voice rising in volume. "It was a fluke. You snuck around behind our backs and sold something that did not belong to you. You do not know the first thing about running a real business. You do not know how to negotiate. You are not smart enough to sit in that chair. You are a filing clerk. That is all you will ever be. A slow, defective clerk. Low defective," she finished her tirade. Breathing heavily, through her nose, she stared at me, waiting for the tears. She waited for my chin to tremble. She expected the verbal abuse to break my spirit and force my compliance, just like it always did when I was a child. I did not shed a single tear. I did not break eye contact. I reached forward and picked up my smartphone. I tapped the screen and stopped the recording. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. With one swipe of my thumb, I held the phone up so the bright screen illuminated the space between us. I let her see the saved audio file pulsing on the display. "Thank you for clarifying your position on my mental competence. Mother," I said quietly, "I am sure that specific terminology will be very useful for my legal counsel if Julian decides to slander my company in the press." The blood drained from Beatrix's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She realized she had just delivered a recorded, unhinged rant filled with verbal abuse and defamation directly into the hands of a woman backed by a global tech conglomerate. She stepped back from the table, stumbling slightly in her designer heels. I picked up my cheap faux leather portfolio. I unzipped my purse and slid the federal patent, the incorporation documents, and the buyout confirmation inside. I zipped the bag shut. I stood up from the heavy leather chairman's seat. I smoothed the wrinkles from my gray pencil skirt. I looked at my father, who was still clutching the edge of the table. I looked at Julian, whose vindictive smirk had melted back into sheer panic. And I looked at my mother, who was staring at my phone as if it were a live grenade. I will save you the trouble of terminating my employment, I announced. My voice carried across the boardroom, echoing cleanly off the acoustic panels. Consider this my formal, immediate resignation as your administrative filing clerk. I will leave my basement keycard with the receptionist on my way out. I turned my back on the Hughes family. I walked toward the frosted glass doors. Mr. Pierce stepped aside, holding the heavy door open for me. He offered a slight deferential nod as I passed. I walked out of the executive suite, leaving the three of them standing in the suffocating silence of their own ruined empire. Walking out of that corporate boardroom on Monday felt like exhaling a breath I had been holding for 26 years. I left my plastic basement keycard on the receptionist desk and walked out into the Seattle rain. I did not look back. By Wednesday morning, my environment had shifted entirely. I was sitting in a temporary executive suite at the Apex Tech headquarters. The contrast was staggering. Instead of painted cinder blocks and buzzing fluorescent lights, I had floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Puget Sound. The desk was sleek white lacquer. The chair was ergonomic. The silence was profound. I was acting as a paid consultant, helping their senior engineering team map out the Meridian software integration. At exactly 9:00 on Wednesday morning, the press embargo officially lifted. The Seattle Business Chronicle published their digital front page. The featured article dominated the screen. The headline read, "Mysterious Female Savant Revitalizes Supply Chains." The investigative journalist detailed how a lone developer operating under a blind corporate structure had engineered the most efficient artificial intelligence routing algorithm in the Pacific Northwest. The article praised the elegance of the code and the sheer audacity of the business execution. The journalist ended the piece by revealing the identity of the phantom architect. My name was in bold print. Vivian Hughes. The commercial logistics sector in Seattle is a very tight insular community. Everyone in that world knew Richard Hughes. Everyone knew about his Stanford-educated son. And the wealthy investors who attended the Sunday garden party certainly knew the daughter who was banished to table 42 near the catering entrance. It did not take long for the financial backers to connect the dots. The phones at the Hughes Global Corporate Tower must have started ringing nonstop by 9:15. The investors realized the narrative my father pitched on the wooden stage was a desperate fiction. Julian did not orchestrate a brilliant technology buyout. The administrative clerk he mocked in front of 200 people had built the software, sold it for a fortune, and left the legacy shipping firm holding an empty bag. The investors realized Hughes Global was not going to secure the retail mega contract. The panic spread through the Stanford alumni networks and the regional banking channels like a wildfire. Shareholders began threatening to pull their capital before the Friday deadline. My brother found himself standing on the deck of a sinking ship on his third day as chief executive officer. To understand what Julian did next, you have to understand how he was conditioned to survive failure. During his sophomore year of high school, Julian failed a crucial advanced placement chemistry exam. Instead of hiring a tutor to help him learn the material, my mother donated new scoreboards to the athletic department, and the failing grade quietly disappeared from his transcript. When he crashed his imported sports car into a retaining wall during his undergraduate years, my father hired a crisis manager to ensure the police report vanished. Julian was taught that reality was malleable. He learned that facts were just obstacles you could bypass with enough money and a good public relations spin. He believed that if you controlled the narrative, you controlled the truth. Faced with a mass exodus of panicked shareholders, Julian went rogue. He bypassed his own internal corporate communications team. He picked up his cell phone and contacted a senior editor at the Pacific Northwest Financial Review. He offered them an exclusive emergency interview, promising to clarify the sudden Apex Tech acquisition. By noon, the resulting article hit the digital newsstands. I sat in my pristine white office, and read the words on my high-resolution monitor. The sheer audacity of his lies made my stomach turn. Julian painted a beautiful, heartwarming fiction for the financial press. He claimed that Project Meridian was actually a secret Hughes Global Incubator initiative. He told the reporter that he had recognized my hidden coding talents years ago. He stated on the record that he personally provided the seed capital for my servers and granted me unrestricted access to the proprietary company routing data. My brother framed the software development as a collaborative mentorship. He cast himself as the visionary leader, guiding his struggling sister toward greatness. He spun the $55 million acquisition as a joint family victory. He assured the public that the buyout was a calculated strategic spin-off designed to generate liquid capital for their upcoming corporate expansion. He lied to the public to prevent a shareholder riot. He stole the credit for my grueling 3-year sacrifice to save his inherited throne. He wanted the Seattle business community to believe I was just a pawn, executing his grand master plan. A soft knock on the glass door broke my concentration. Mr. Pierce stepped into the office. The lead counsel for Apex Tech held a silver tablet in his hand. His bespoke suit was perfectly pressed. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly unamused. "I see you have read the afternoon press cycle." "Mr. Pierce said, placing the tablet on my desk. The screen displayed the exact article I was reading. "Your brother possesses a very active imagination. His interview is currently stabilizing the Hughes global stock valuation. The regional banks are pausing their foreclosure proceedings because they believe his narrative. They think your family is flush with Apex capital." I kept my eyes on the screen. "He is trying to trap me in a public relations war." I replied, "He knows I hate the spotlight. He assumes I will stay quiet rather than initiate a media circus." "Mr. Pierce pulled out a leather chair and sat across from me. He crossed his legs and folded his hands in his lap. "Apex Tech Legal Department has reviewed the published claims," he stated smoothly. "Julian Hughes has made false statements regarding the ownership and development of our proprietary software that constitutes actionable defamation and tortious interference. I have a team drafting a response. We can handle this quietly if you prefer." He offered me a standard corporate exit strategy. I can issue a discreet cease and desist letter directly to the publisher. Pice explained. "We can force the magazine to print a quiet retraction buried on the back pages. It will stop the narrative from spreading without dragging you into a public spectacle. We can let Hughes Global quietly collapse on Friday when the truth filters out to the creditors." I thought about the offer. A quiet retraction was the safe path. It was the professional path, but it was also the exact same dynamic I had endured my entire life. Whenever my parents dismissed my struggles, it was always done quietly. Whenever Julian took credit for my ideas in the past, it was handled behind closed doors. They relied on my silence. They weaponized my desire to avoid conflict. If I sent a quiet letter to the publisher, Julian would just spin that. 2. He would tell his investors that Apex Tech forced a retraction on a technicality, but the core story was still true. He would maintain his illusion of superiority. Playing defense was no longer an option. I reached out and closed the browser window on my monitor. I looked at the silver-haired lawyer. "No quiet retractions," I said. My voice was steady. "If we send a discreet letter, Julian will just find another publication and tell another lie. He thinks he can rewrite history because nobody has ever forced him to defend his fiction under oath." "Mr. Pierce raised a single eyebrow. The faintest hint of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Vivian," I leaned forward, resting my arms on the sleek white desk. "I want to stop playing defense." I told him, "I want to actively dismantle his fabricated reality in the most public way possible." I want you to draft a cease and desist order, but I do not want it sent to the publisher. I want Julian served directly. I want the threat of a devastating defamation lawsuit hanging right over his head. I want to back him into a corner so tight he does something reckless. My brother believed he was a mastermind. He believed he could lie his way out of a financial death spiral. He thought I was just a minor obstacle he could swat away with a magazine interview. I was going to use his own arrogance to set a trap. I was going to force him to bring his lies into a legal arena where public relations spin could not save him. Mr. Pierce stood up from the leather chair. He picked up his silver tablet. I will have the documents drafted and served by 5:00 this evening, Pierce said. His tone was brisk and surgical. Your brother is about to learn that lying to a reporter is a very different game than lying to a judge. The lawyer walked out of the office, leaving me alone with the Seattle skyline. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart over the water. Julian wanted a war of narratives. He was about to get a masterclass in consequences, and he was going to trigger a desperate legal maneuver that would expose the darkest elements of our family history. The legal courier bypassed the standard reception desk at Hughes Global Logistics and took the private elevator directly to the executive floor. He did not ask for a signature from an administrative assistant. He walked straight into Julian's corner office and dropped a thick, sealed envelope onto the center of the desk. The document inside was printed on the heavy, watermarked stationery of Apex Tech. It was a formal cease and desist order, but it read like a ransom note. Mr. Pierce had executed my instructions with surgical precision. The letter systematically dismantled every lie Julian told to the financial magazine. It cited specific state laws regarding corporate defamation and tortious interference. But the true threat was buried in the final paragraph. The ultimatum was not a quiet request for a printed retraction. It was a demand for public surrender. Julian was given exactly 24 hours to organize a press conference. He was ordered to stand in front of the Seattle business media and confess that he fabricated the entire mentorship narrative. He had to state on the record that he provided zero funding, zero guidance, and zero support for Project Meridian. He had to admit that his sister acted alone and that his interview was a calculated lie designed to manipulate shareholder confidence. If Julian refused to clear my name in public, the licensing lifeline was dead. Apex Tech would officially withdraw the integration offer. The retail conglomerate would walk away, and Hughes Global would default on their loans by the end of the week. I was not in the building to witness his reaction, but I knew exactly what happened next. Julian panicked. He realized he could not charm his way out of a binding legal threat from a corporate titan. The golden boy finally hit a wall he could not buy his way through. He took the cease and desist letter and ran down the hall to our father. Richard Hughes read the ultimatum and recognized the lethal corner they were backed into. He knew Julian could not survive a public confession. Admitting to deliberate market manipulation would trigger a shareholder lawsuit that would bankrupt them even faster than losing the retail contract. They could not comply with the Apex demand, and they could not afford to fight a defamation battle in court. So my father pivoted. He abandoned the corporate battlefield entirely. He shifted his focus to a much darker and deeply personal strategy. When I was 8 years old, my parents realized I could not memorize multiplication tables or read paragraphs at the same pace as my peers. Instead of sitting down and helping me learn, they treated me like a defective product. They spent thousands of dollars dragging me to pediatric psychiatrists and developmental specialists across King County. They sat in pristine waiting rooms while doctors subjected me to hours of cognitive testing. My parents wanted a medical diagnosis to excuse my academic failure. They wanted a clinical label they could use to explain away their imperfect child at country club dinners. The doctors handed them thick manila folders filled with terms like severe attention deficit and auditory processing disorder. My parents took those files home and locked them in a steel safe. They kept those medical records for decades, using them as permanent proof that I was fundamentally broken, faced with the imminent destruction of his shipping empire. Richard unlocked that safe. He gathered my childhood medical files and hired a predatory family law attorney, known for vicious tactics. They combed through the decades-old psychiatric evaluations, looking for specific clinical phrases they could weaponize. They found an archaic legal loophole in the state civil code. They drafted an emergency injunction for a temporary conservatorship. My father filed a petition in civil court, claiming I lacked the mental competence to manage my own affairs. He used my childhood learning struggles to argue that I was a vulnerable, disabled adult. The legal filing painted a grotesque picture. Richard claimed I was prone to manipulation, and that Apex Tech had taken advantage of my cognitive deficits to steal my routing software. He told the judge that a person with my documented limitations could not possibly comprehend the scope of a $55 million corporate buyout. The goal of the injunction was brutal and clear. Richard asked the court to freeze my bank accounts, halt the software acquisition, and declare me legally incompetent. He petitioned the judge to appoint him as my official financial guardian. If the judge agreed, my father would gain total legal control over my assets, my software, and my life. He would strip away my human autonomy and use my money to save his failing business. It was Thursday evening. The sun was setting over the Puget Sound, casting a deep orange glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment. I had moved into a secure high-rise building in downtown Seattle earlier that morning. There were no rattling train tracks outside my window. There were no painted cinder block walls. I was standing in a modern kitchen, pouring a glass of water, when the intercom buzzed. The building concierge apologized and informed me that a process server was waiting in the lobby with urgent legal documents. I told the concierge to send the man up to my floor. I opened my front door and accepted the heavy stack of legal papers. The server turned and walked toward the elevator without a word. I carried the documents to my kitchen island. I flipped past the cover sheet and read the allegations printed on the 6-ly, crisp white paper. I read the words, mental incompetence and financial guardianship. I saw the photocopies of my childhood psychiatric evaluations attached as exhibits. The emotional hit was sharp and sickening. It is one thing for your family to fire you or yell at you in a boardroom. It is an entirely different level of betrayal for your own parents to legally attempt to strip away your basic independence. They were trying to erase me as an adult functioning citizen. They wanted to lock me in a legal cage so they could pick my pockets. A decade ago, reading those documents would have broken my spirit. I would have collapsed on the hardwood floor and cried until I could not breathe. I would have believed their narrative. But I was no longer the frightened girl hiding in their basement. I was the architect of Meridian Logistics. I did not shed a single tear. I did not call my lawyer in a panic. I set my glass of water down on the granite counter. I picked up the injunction papers and walked over to my dining table. My father wanted to drag at me into a courtroom and debate mental capacity. He wanted to stand in front of a judge and scrutinize my ability to comprehend complex financial structures. He wanted to prove that he was the responsible business patriarch, and I was just a confused child. He made a fatal strategic error. He forgot who processed his paperwork for the last 4 years. During my time in the Hughes Global basement, I did not just file shipping manifests and driver logs. I was the administrative catch-all for the entire executive suite. I archived the internal accounting ledgers. I processed the banking statements. I filed the quarterly profit margins. I sat down at my dining table and opened my laptop. I connected to the secure offshore cloud servers where I stored my Meridian code. But I did not open my routing algorithm. I opened a hidden encrypted folder containing thousands of digital copies of Hughes Global internal records. I had the receipts for every single reckless decision my family ever made. I pulled up the records of the high-interest corporate loans my father signed just to cover the monthly payroll. I opened the ledgers detailing the massive capital Julian wasted on failed marketing campaigns during his summer internships. I had documented proof of executives expensing lavish country club dinners while the company delayed health insurance premiums for the freight drivers. I spent the entire night bathed in the blue light of my monitor. I did not sleep. I used the same hyper-focus that built my artificial intelligence platform to organize 3 years of raw, unedited financial failure. I compiled the spreadsheets into a clear, undeniable visual presentation. I created charts, mapping their exact debt ratios and their plummeting profit margins. My father built his conservatorship case on childhood medical evaluations and old report cards. I was building my defense on hard, empirical corporate data. If my family wanted to use an emergency court hearing to discuss cognitive ability and financial incompetence, I was ready. I was going to walk into that courtroom and give the judge a masterclass in reality. I was going to dissect their inherited empire piece by piece and show the world exactly who was unfit to manage a business. The courtroom in downtown Seattle smelled of floor wax and polished leather. It was a sterile, intimidating environment designed to strip away your comfort and expose your vulnerabilities. Judge Harrison sat behind a high mahogany bench, overlooking the proceedings with a stern, detached gaze. My father had spared no expense for his legal assault. He hired Arthur Vance, a notoriously aggressive family law attorney who wore a sharp charcoal suit and treated witnesses like hostile prey. Richard and Julian sat at the plaintiff table, projecting an aura of concerned patriarchs. They wore matching somber ties and kept their expressions carefully arranged into masks of paternal sorrow. Vance began his opening statement by weaponizing my childhood. He paced in front of the judge, painting a portrait of a deeply troubled, dependent girl who lived in a fantasy world. He walked over to the evidence projector and displayed a series of scanned documents on the large monitor. They were my high school standardized test scores and pediatric psychiatric evaluations from 15 years ago. Looking at those numbers projected in a civil courtroom brought back a distinct, suffocating memory. I remembered sitting in a cramped guidance counselor office when I was 16 years old. My parents sat next to me, nodding solemnly as the counselor explained that my reading comprehension ranked in the bottom 10th percentile. They treated my brain like a terminal diagnosis that required lifelong management. Now, their expensive attorney was using those exact same outdated metrics to argue that a woman incapable of passing standard algebra could not possibly negotiate a $55 million technology acquisition. Vance told the judge I was a spiteful employee who manipulated company data out of childish rebellion. He argued that I needed immediate financial guardianship for my own protection because I lacked the basic cognitive function to understand the contracts I was signing. When it was my turn to testify, I stood up from the defense table and walked to the witness box. I did not bring a legal pad. I did not carry a single piece of paper. Mr. Pierce, my corporate counsel, sat quietly at his table, offering a reassuring nod. But he knew I did not need him to hold my hand. I placed my right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Arthur Vance approached the podium. He smiled a thin, predatory smile. He intended to confuse me with complex corporate jargon. He wanted to frustrate me until I broke down in tears, proving to the judge that I lacked emotional and cognitive stability. Miss Hughes Vance began his tone, dripping with practiced condescension. Your father claims you possess a rudimentary understanding of the logistics industry at best. You expect this court to believe you independently developed and sold a multi-million-dollar artificial intelligence platform. Let us test that theory. Can you even define the basic operating margins required to sustain a regional freight fleet without referring to a textbook? I looked at the attorney. I did not see a sterile courtroom anymore. I saw the spreadsheets. The raw data illuminated in my mind, forming perfect interlocking visual structures. I can define the operating margins of a successful fleet. I answered calmly, but it would be far more relevant to define the operating margins of my father's fleet. In the third quarter of last year, Hughes Global operated at a negative 14% margin. The fuel deficit alone reached $2.4 million due to an archaic routing system that prioritized circular dispatching over linear load matching. Vance frowned. He glanced down at his notes. That is a generalized guess. He stated, "It is not a guess." I replied. My voice carried clearly across the quiet room. On October 12th, your client secured a short-term high-yield bridging loan from Pacific Northwest Trust for $4.2 million at an interest rate of 11%. He used that capital to cover the driver payroll because the accounts receivable division was running a 90-day lag. On November 4th, my brother Julian authorized a regional marketing campaign intended to secure new agricultural contracts. He spent $350,000 on print and digital advertising. The return on that investment was exactly 0 new contracts. The capital was entirely incinerated to stroke his ego. Julian shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Richard stared at me, his jaw tight. I continued rattling off the numbers without blinking. I cited the exact depreciation values of their aging truck fleet. I recited the specific dates they defaulted on their minor vendor payments. I laid bare the precise mathematical anatomy of their dying empire. I named the bank account routing numbers and the outstanding invoice totals. I did not need notes because I had spent 4 years staring at their failure in a windowless basement. My visual processing disorder meant I could never forget a single digit I had typed into their outdated system. Vance gripped the edges of his podium. His predatory confidence began to fracture. He tried to interrupt me, but Judge Harrison raised a hand, silencing the attorney. The judge leaned forward, looking at me with intense, genuine curiosity. "You have a remarkable memory," Miss Hughes Vance snapped, trying to regain control of his narrative. "But memorizing stolen company ledgers does not prove you have the business acumen to manage a $55 million asset. It simply proves you are an observant clerk. You have no real-world executive experience. You do not know how to generate revenue. You are dependent on your family for your very survival." That was the exact opening I had been waiting for. "I am not dependent on my family," I said. "For the last 6 months, my family has been entirely dependent on me." Vance let out a short, mocking laugh. "That is an absurd delusion." I turned my attention away from the lawyer and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I said smoothly, "my legal counsel has submitted a secondary evidence binder to the court clerk. I ask that you turn to Exhibit 4. Judge Harrison opened the thick binder resting on his elevated bench. He flipped to the designated tab. Vance scrambled back to the plaintiff table to look at his own copy of the defense submissions. "What you are looking at is a verified transactional ledger from Meridian Logistics," I explained. 6 months ago, my routing algorithm began attracting more regional overflow clients than my digital servers could independently process. I had excess shipping contracts and no physical trucks to move the freight. Hughes Global had dozens of empty trucks sitting in their lots because they were rapidly losing their legacy clients to faster competitors. I paused, letting the silence build in the room. I looked directly at my father. I set up a blind vendor proxy. I continued. I routed my overflow Meridian contracts directly into the Hughes Global dispatch system. I paid your company a premium rate to haul my excess freight. If you look at the banking records, Your Honor, you will see that Meridian Logistics was the source of 38% of Hughes Global's total revenue over the last 2 fiscal quarters. The air vanished from the courtroom. Vance stared at the paper in front of him. The banking routing numbers were irrefutable. The digital footprint traced directly back to my offshore limited liability company. Julian covered his mouth with his hand. Richard slumped back in his chair. The patriarch who had marched into civil court to declare his daughter incompetent was suddenly staring at empirical proof that he was a corporate welfare recipient. I did not steal from them, Your Honor. I stated, my gaze fixed on the judge. I subsidized them. I paid their fuel costs. I met their payroll. The veteran chief executive officer and the Stanford-educated heir apparent have been unknowingly surviving on the charity of the exact same daughter they are currently trying to lock in a conservatorship. I leaned forward in the witness box, resting my hands on the wooden rail. I did not ask for a single share of equity in return. I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, razor-sharp register. I did it because they were family, and their response to my success was to drag me into a federal building and attempt to strip away my basic human rights. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I sat in the witness box, watching the reality of the situation crush the last remaining fragments of my father's pride. He had tried to expose my weakness in a court of law, relying on ancient test scores and psychiatric labels. Instead, he had just handed me the scalpel to dissect his own catastrophic failure on the public record. Judge Harrison closed the thick evidence binder. The sound of the heavy cardboard cover slapping against the mahogany bench echoed like a gunshot in the sterile room. He took off his reading glasses and stared down at the plaintiff table. Arthur Vance, the ruthless family attorney, suddenly found the grain of the wood on his desk fascinating. The high-priced lawyer stopped taking notes and slowly set his pen down. He knew the case was dead. The silence stretched tight across the courtroom. It was not the nervous quiet of anticipation. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap snapping shut. Judge Harrison did not mince words. He leaned over the bench and fixed his gaze directly on my father. Mr. Hughes. The judge began, his voice cold and precise. The civil court system is designed to protect vulnerable citizens from exploitation. It is not a tool for corporate extortion. It is not a weapon you can deploy to cover your own catastrophic financial mismanagement. You walked into my courtroom and attempted to strip away your daughter's autonomy while simultaneously surviving on her hidden charity. The sheer audacity of this petition borders on the pathological. Richard Hughes slouched in his chair. He could not look the judge in the eye. Then Judge Harrison turned his eye toward Julian. During the initial emergency filing, Julian submitted a stack of sworn affidavit. He included printed email chains he claimed were proof of his ongoing mentorship and financial oversight of Meridian Logistics. He tried to use fake correspondence to establish an ownership trail. My forensic accounting team had reviewed those specific printouts. We submitted the digital server logs, proving the dates and routing addresses on Julian's emails were fabricated. Mr. Julian Hughes. The judge continued, his tone dropping to a dangerous register. You submitted falsified documents to a federal judge. Committing perjury to steal a technology asset is a severe offense. I am striking your fraudulent exhibits from the record. Furthermore, I am imposing a financial sanction of $200,000 against you personally for fabricating evidence. I am also mandating a formal referral to the State Commercial Ethics Board. Julian stopped breathing. His posture crumbled. The Stanford degree, the elite alumni network, and the country club handshakes were instantly rendered toxic. No reputable logistics firm in Seattle would ever hire a chief executive tagged with federal sanctions for fraud. His career was over before it even began. I will not allow this court to be manipulated. Judge Harrison declared, I am dismissing this conservatorship petition with prejudice. You are barred from ever filing this action again. I am ordering the clerk to unseal the final transcript of these proceedings. The truth of this matter will be a matter of public record. The truth was now permanent. The court officially recognized Vivian Hughes as the sole brilliant owner of Meridian Logistics. Hughes Global was formally exposed as a hollow failing shell. Judge Harrison struck his wooden gavel. The sharp crack signaled the official end of my father's reign. I stepped down from the witness box. I retrieved my cheap faux leather portfolio from the defense table. Mr. Pierce offered a quiet, respectful nod. He did not need to say congratulations. The devastation on the other side of the aisle spoke for itself. Arthur Vance packed his premium leather briefcase with frantic speed. He did not shake my father's hand. He did not offer any parting legal advice. The shark smelled dead blood in the water and abandoned his clients without a second glance. I pushed through the heavy double oak doors and stepped out of the courtroom. The wide marble corridor was bathed in the harsh light of the late afternoon sun, filtering through the arched windows. I walked toward the elevator bank. My heels clicked a steady rhythm against the stone floor. I pressed the call button and waited. The heavy oak doors opened behind me. Footsteps echoed down the hall. I did not turn around. I watched the brass numbers above the elevator shift as the car descended. Vivian. Wait. The voice was raspy and weak. It did not sound like the booming patriarch who dictated family dinners and fired truck drivers for minor infractions. It sounded like an old, broken man. I turned slowly. Richard Hughes stood 10 feet away. Julian lingered a few paces behind him, staring blankly at the marble tiles. Julian was a ghost. The arrogant smirk was erased. My father took a hesitant step forward. The crisp lines of his tailored suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if he had aged a decade in the span of an hour. His signature swagger was gone. The intimidating corporate dictator who banished me to the basement had vanished. Growing up, my father used to tell me that business was a game of leverage. He told me the person holding the gold makes the rules. He used that cold philosophy to justify every cruel decision he ever made. He cut holiday bonuses for the warehouse staff to buy a new boat. He refused to pay for my specialized learning tutors because I did not offer a fast enough return on his investment. He worshiped leverage above human decency. Now I held all of it. You won, Vivian, my father said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He stopped 2 feet away from me. He looked at my face and then looked down at his expensive shoes. You proved it. In front of the judge. In front of the lawyers. You outsmarted all of us. He reached out an unsteady hand but stopped before touching my arm. He pulled his hand back and swallowed hard. I am sorry, he whispered. I stared at him. The apology did not carry any warmth. It carried desperation. I am sorry for the filing. Richard continued, his voice trembling. I was desperate. The banks called this morning. They are seizing the freight trucks on Friday. The retail contract is gone. The cash reserves are empty. We have nothing left. He took a deep breath, abandoning the very last shreds of his lifelong pride. He looked me directly in the eyes. You are the only true business genius in this family. Vivian, he confessed. There it was. The validation I had spent my entire childhood chasing. The acknowledgement I had worked myself to the bone to secure. He finally admitted I was brilliant. He finally saw my worth. But hearing the words out loud did not fix the broken pieces inside me. The praise felt hollow. He was not saying it because he loved me. He was saying it because he was terrified. I was too blind to see your potential. My father pleaded, Julian cannot fix this. I cannot fix this. Please. Vivian, I am begging you. He clasped his hands together. The patriarch of the Hughes family was begging the slow girl for his life. Buy us out. Richard pleaded. Use the Apex Tech Capital and buy Hughes Global. Save the family legacy. You can name your price. You can restructure the whole board. Just do not let the bank erase my entire life work on Friday. Please throw us a lifeline. I stood in the quiet marble corridor and looked at the two men who had tormented me for decades. I watched my father beg for his corporate survival. I watched my brother stare at the floor. Stripped of his unearned title and his fraudulent future, they had tried to lock me in a legal cage to steal my creation. Now they were drowning in a cage of their own making. The elevator arrived with a soft digital chime. The brass doors slid open, revealing an empty car. I held their fate in my hands. The ultimate choice belonged to me alone. I could turn my back, step into the elevator, and let the banks tear their empire to shreds. Or I could buy the ruins and show them exactly how a real chief executive operates. The marble corridor was silent, except for the soft hum of the elevator motor holding the car on our floor. My father stood before me, waiting for an answer. He was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of control. And now he was offering me the keys to his kingdom because it was on fire. I looked at Richard Hughes. I looked at Julian standing a few paces behind him. Staring at the ground, I had the power to let the banks tear them apart on Friday. It would have been easy to step into the elevator and watch them drown from the safety of my new penthouse. But allowing the banks to foreclose meant hundreds of warehouse workers, dispatchers, and drivers would lose their jobs. Those employees had families. They had mortgages. They were not responsible for the catastrophic arrogance of the executive suite. I could not destroy their livelihoods just to settle a personal score with my father. I took my hand off the elevator button. The doors slid shut, leaving us alone in the quiet hallway. I will buy the company, I said. My father let out a long, shuddering breath. He closed his eyes and his shoulders slumped. The relief washed over him so powerfully, he almost lost his balance. Thank you, Vivian, he whispered. His voice was thick with emotion. I promise you we can make this work. Julian and I can step back into advisory roles. We will give you a seat on the board. We can rebuild I raised my hand, cutting him off before he could finish his desperate negotiation. You misunderstand the situation. Richard, I stated coldly, dropping the title of father. This is not a partnership. You do not dictate the terms of your rescue. I am not throwing you a lifeline, so you can maintain the illusion of power. I reached into my faux leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I had asked Mr. Faust Pierce to draft it the night before, predicting they would beg for a buyout once the conservatorship failed. I handed the crisp white document to my father. Apex Tech is willing to acquire the physical assets of Hughes Global Logistics. I explained, we are buying the trucks, the warehouses, and the existing vendor contracts. We are assuming the corporate debt to prevent Friday's foreclosure. We are paying you exactly 10 cents on the dollar for the remaining equity. You will receive enough capital to pay off your personal mortgages and avoid federal bankruptcy. But that is the extent of my generosity. Richard stared at the acquisition terms. The numbers were brutal. 10 cents on the dollar meant the vast family fortune was officially erased. The $15 million Bellevue estate would likely have to be sold. The country club memberships would lapse. They were being reduced from regional billionaires to upper-middle-class citizens in the span of a single afternoon. But the financial terms were not the true punishment. The punishment was the restructuring clauses written in bold ink at the bottom of the page. To execute this acquisition, I demand absolute executive surrender. I continued my voice, echoing cleanly against the marble walls. Richard, you will sign a formal resignation letter effective immediately. You will take an early forced retirement. You will not receive a golden parachute. You will not retain a seat on the board. You will never set foot in the corporate tower again. If you violate this clause, I will kill the acquisition and let the creditors seize your remaining assets. My father swallowed hard. He looked at the paper and then looked at me. He was losing his empire, but he was avoiding federal ruin. He nodded slowly, accepting the terms of his banishment. Then I turned my attention to the Stanford graduate. Julian, I said sharply. Commanding his attention, my brother slowly raised his head. His eyes were red, rimmed, and bloodshot. The arrogant air apparent was entirely hollowed out by the perjury sanctions. You are being stripped of your title as Chief Executive Officer. I informed him. You are surrendering all your corporate equity. You are vacating the corner office. Apex Tech is bringing in an entirely new executive leadership team on Monday morning to clean up the financial mess you created. Julian clenched his jaw. His pride flared for a brief second before reality extinguished it. He knew he had no leverage. He was a disgraced executive facing a massive personal fine for fabricating evidence. I am firing you, I told him directly, but I am not leaving you entirely destitute. I reached back into my portfolio and pulled out a second document. It was a standard employee, contract printed on Hughes Global Stationery. I held it out to him. Julian hesitated before taking the paper. His hands were shaking. You have 0 job prospects anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. Julian, I stated, laying out the cold, hard facts. No reputable firm will hire a man who committed perjury to steal a technology asset. If you walk out of this courthouse today without a salary, you will default on your personal debts within a month. So, I am offering you exactly one position. Julian looked down at the contract. His eyes scanned the job title in the salary bracket. The color drained from his face, leaving him deathly pale. You are offering me a job as a logistics coordinator, Julian whispered. His voice was a thin, raspy thread. Yes, I replied. It is a mid-level administrative role. Your starting salary will be $45. 000 a year. You will not have an office with a window. You will report directly to Marcus, the Chief Operating Officer. You will spend your days manually cross-referencing the physical shipping manifests with the new digital integration system to ensure accuracy. Julian stared at me in horror. You want me to work in the basement? He asked. The disbelief choked his words. You want me to sit at your old metal desk? That is exactly where you are going. I confirmed. The logistics coordinator role requires extreme attention to detail. It requires a willingness to perform tedious, unglamorous labor to ensure the success of the larger operation. It is the exact kind of real work you spent your entire life belittling. You told the investors, I belonged in the basement because I was too slow to handle real business. Now you are going to learn exactly how the machinery operates from the ground floor. Julian's pride screamed at him to reject the offer. He wanted to tear the contract in half and walk away. He wanted to preserve his illusion of superiority. But the reality of his situation was a crushing weight pressing down on his chest. He was drowning in debt. His reputation was toxic. He needed the meager $45, 000 salary, just to survive. He looked at our father, desperate for a different solution. Richard did not look back. My father was too busy signing his own forced retirement papers against the marble wall of the corridor. Julian was entirely alone. He looked back at the employee contract in his hands. He read the restrictive clauses preventing him from ever accessing the executive elevator. He read the designated workspace assignment indicating Subble 2, he was being legally bound to the exact same metal desk where I had built my $55 million empire. Tears of profound, Humiliation welled in Julian's eyes. The golden boy. The Stanford genius. The man who thought he was born to rule Seattle was finally breaking. The facade shattered completely. Julian reached into his jacket pocket. His hand trembled violently as he pulled out a silver pen. He leaned against the cool marble wall of the courthouse hallway. He pressed the pen to the paper. I watched him sign the contract. I watched him legally demote himself to a basement-level clerk. He handed the paper back to me without saying a word. He could not meet my gaze. He simply turned around and walked slowly down the long corridor, his footsteps heavy and defeated. I took the signed documents and placed them carefully inside my portfolio. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. I felt a deep, clean sense of closure. The war was officially over. The empire was secured, and the men who had spent decades calling me the dumb one were finally forced to acknowledge exactly who was in charge. I pressed the elevator button. The brass door slid open. I stepped inside, ready to begin the massive task of restructuring a dying company. I was going to strip away the archaic management protocols and rebuild Hughes Global into an efficient, modern machine. The real work was just beginning. The morning air off Elliott Bay is crisp and carries the faint scent of salt water and roasted coffee. I stand on the glass balcony of my downtown Seattle penthouse, holding a ceramic mug. Letting the wind pull at my hair, the city stretches out below me, a sprawling grid of steel and concrete, bathed in the pale morning light. 1 year has passed since I walked out of that federal courthouse and restructured the foundation of my life. I am 27 years old now. I do not sort paper manifests anymore. I hold the title of Vice President of Automated Logistics at Apex Tech. My days are spent in sleek boardrooms and high-tech engineering labs. I oversee a division of 80 developers. Together, we deployed Project Meridian across the entire Western Seaboard, mapping and optimizing freight routes from Vancouver down to San Diego. The integration of Hughes Global into the Apex network was clinical and efficient. The regional shipping firm that once teetered on the edge of bankruptcy is now a highly profitable automated subsidiary. The business world moved on quickly. The industry executives, who used to toast my father's outdated metrics, now seek my signature on their partnership agreements. I am no longer the invisible girl in the shadows. I am the architect. While my environment shifted upward, the reality for the men who tormented me took a steep precisagivi. It is Monday morning. 4 miles south of my penthouse down in sublevel, 2 of the Hughes Global corporate tower. The fluorescent lights still hum with that same headache-inducing frequency. Julian is sitting at my old metal desk. The bespoke linen suits and imported Italian loafers are gone. He wears a faded button-down shirt and practical rubber-soled shoes. He is holding a plastic yellow highlighter marking discrepancies on a printed terminal report. Marcus, the veteran chief operating officer, walks into the cinder block room and drops a fresh stack of routing errors onto the metal desk. Julian does not sneer. He does not boast about his Stanford degree or his elite alumni network. He simply nods, picks up the paperwork, and begins entering the data into the system. His hands have developed calluses from the repetitive physical grind of the job. My brother is learning the unglamorous mechanics of the industry he thought he could rule by birthright. He is forced to confront the tedious labor required to keep a logistics machine running. The federal perjury sanction erased his high society prospects. The wealthy fraternity brothers who drank champagne at his graduation party stopped returning his phone calls the moment his reputation turned toxic. The basement is his entire professional universe. Now the arrogance has been burned away, replaced by the humbling, quiet reality of a $45,000 salary. He is finally doing the actual work. The descent for my parents was even more pronounced. The liquidation of their equity covered their corporate debts, but it erased their billionaire lifestyle. The sprawling Bellevue estate, with its manicured hedges and waterfront docks, was sold to a foreign software executive last October. Richard and Beatrice Hughes now reside in a modest two-bedroom condominium in a dense suburban neighborhood near Linwood. There are no catered garden parties. There are no crystal champagne flutes. The authentic saltwater pearls and designer cashmere sweaters remain boxed in the closet because there are no exclusive charity galas left to attend. The Seattle elite operate on a strict caste system based entirely on leverage and public perception. Once Richard lost his shipping empire and Julian became a legal liability, the dinner invitations evaporated. The country club quietly declined to renew their membership. My parents built their entire marriage on projecting an image of superiority. They weaponized their wealth to hide their own failures. Now, they spend their days tending a small concrete patio garden and watching daytime television. The silence in their condominium is profound. Without a captive audience to manipulate their kingdom is just a quiet, empty room. I take a slow sip of my coffee and look away from the Seattle skyline. I look directly into the camera lens. If you are listening to this story right now, I want you to pay very close attention to what happened here. Society spends billions of dollars trying to force square pegs into round holes. Teachers and doctors and parents look at a brain that processes information differently, and they immediately apply a negative label. They call you slow. They call you distracted. They tell you to lower your expectations and accept your designated place at the bottom of the hierarchy. They condition you to believe that their standard of intelligence is the only valid metric in the world. You cannot let a system built by people who do not understand you dictate your intrinsic worth. My inability to read a standard textbook or memorize a historical date was not a symptom of a broken mind. It was the exact neurological trait that allowed me to visualize a $55 million artificial intelligence algorithm. The very things my family mocked, the traits they tried to hide in a windowless room, were the architecture of my success. Your flaws might not be defects at all. They might be the exact tools you need to build your own empire. You just have to stop trying to play their game and start writing your own code. People often ask me if I forgive my father and my brother for what they did. Forgiveness is a complex transaction. I do not harbor a burning hatred for my family. Hatred requires too much daily energy, and I have a technology division to run. But I learned a vital lesson in that courthouse hallway 1 year ago. The greatest revenge you can exact upon the people who abuse you is not a screaming match in a corporate boardroom. It is not demanding tearful apologies or forcing them to admit they were wrong. Arrogant people will never give you the closure you desire because their egos cannot survive the truth. True revenge is clinical. It is cold and it is quiet. True revenge is simply stepping aside and letting arrogant people experience the full, devastating weight of their own ignorance. You stop fixing their mistakes. You stop protecting them from the consequences of their actions. You let their own greed dismantle their reality while you secure your future. You hand them the exact life they earned, and you walk away. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Building this story and sharing it with you has been a reminder of how far we can climb when we stop asking for permission. If my story resonated with you today, I want to hear from you. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family, if you have ever turned a supposed weakness into a weapon, drop a comment below. Tell me your story. Let this community know they are not fighting in the dark alone. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new narrative. Keep building your empire quietly. Keep trusting your own mind. Eventually, the people who doubted you will have no choice but to stand in your light. Until next time, take care of yourselves and never apologize for who you really are. Looking out over the Seattle skyline from my penthouse, I realize how far I've come since my days in that windowless basement. My family. I tried to bury me because I didn't fit their mold of a perfect legacy. But surviving them taught me two vital truths. First, never let a system built by people who don't understand you dictate your worth. The exact traits my parents mocked as flaws, my hyperfocus and visual processing, were the exact tools I needed to build a $55 million empire. Your differences aren't defects. They are your distinct advantage. Second, the greatest revenge isn't screaming, fighting, or begging for an apology that will never come. True revenge is clinical. It's simply removing your safety net and letting arrogant people experience the full devastating weight of their own ignorance while you step into your true power. If you've ever been underestimated or treated like the scapegoat, I want you to know you aren't alone. Thank you for listening to my journey here on Hazel Stories. If this resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and drop a comment below to share your own story. Keep building your empire quietly,